Good morning, guys. We're going to go ahead and jump into chapter 7 with reading 13 of the Graveyard Book. We have just chapter 7, 8, and 9 to go. It looks like chapter 7 is the longest chapter. So while I will try to get through it in 2 readings, just seriously do not be surprised if this ends up being almost 3 because it is about 100 pages. So let's go ahead and jump into it. Again, we're having another no excuse day. Ooh, hold on, I gotta sneeze. I hope you guys didn't have to suffer through that sneeze. It was pretty bad. Okay, so again, another no excuse day. Go ahead and grab your novel, turn to page 211. That's the beginning of chapter 7. You should have a fresh plot diagram for today's reading. Remember, though, because you won't hear the entire chapter, most of your notes are going to be focused on exposition and some of rising action. Okay? Don't get caught up in the details when it comes to your rising action. We're looking at overall summary statements. Okay? Right. So, yeah, go ahead and grab a novel. If you're on the computer, go ahead and open up your PDF version so that we can go ahead and get started. We're on page 211. Okay. Chapter 7, Every Man Jack. Silas had been preoccupied for the previous several months. He had begun to leave the graveyard for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Over Christmas, Miss Lepensky had come out for 3 weeks in his place, and Bod had shared her meals in her little flat in the old town. She had even taken him to a football match, as Silas had promised that she would. But she had gone back to the place she called the Old Country after squeezing Bod's cheeks and calling him Nimini, which had become her pet name for him. Now Silas was gone, and Miss Lepensky also. Mr. and Mrs. Owens were sitting in Josiah Worthington's tomb, talking to Josiah Worthington. None of them was happy. Josiah Worthington said, "You mean to say that he did not tell either of you where he was going or how the child was to be cared for?" When the Owenses shook their heads, Josiah Worthington said, "Well, where is he?" Neither Owenses was able to answer. Master Owen said, "He's never been gone for so long before, and he promised when the child came to us, promised he would be here, or someone else would be here to help us care for him. He promised." Mrs. Owen said, "I worry that something must have happened to him." She seemed close to tears, and then her tears turned to anger, and she said, "This is too bad of him. Is there no way to find him, to call him back?" "None that I know," said Josiah Worthington. "But I believe he's left money in the crypt for food for the boy." "Money?" said Mrs. Owens. "What use is money?" "Bod will be needing money if he's to go out there to buy food," began Mr. Owens, but Mrs. Owens turned on him. "You're all as bad as each other," she said. She left the Worthington tomb then, and she went looking for her son, whom she found, as she expected to, at the top of the hill, staring out over the town. "Penny for your thoughts," said Mrs. Owens. "You don't have a penny," said Bod. He was 14 now and taller than his mother. "I've got 2 in the coffin," said Mrs. Owens, "probably a bit green by now, but I still got them right enough." "I was thinking about the world," said Bod. "How do we even know that the person who killed my family is still alive, that he's still out there?" "Silas said he is," said Mrs. Owens. "But Silas doesn't tell us anything else." Mrs. Owens said, "He means only the best for you. You know that." "Thanks," said Bod, unimpressed. "So where is he?" Mrs. Owens made no reply. Bud said, "You saw the man who killed my family, didn't you, on the day you adopted me?" Mrs. Owens nodded. "What was he like?" "Mostly, I had eyes for you. Let me see." "He had dark hair, very dark, and I was frightened of him. He had a sharp face. Hungry and angry all at once, he was. Silas saw him off." "But why didn't Silas just kill him?" said Bod fiercely. "He should have just killed him then." Mrs. Owens touched the back of Bod's hand with her cold fingers. She said, "He's not a monster, Bod. If Silas had killed him back then, I would be safe now. I could go anywhere." "Silas knows more than you do about this, more than any of us do. And Silas knows about life and death," and Mrs. Owens. "It's not that easy." Bod said, "What is his name, the man who killed them?" "He didn't say it, not then." Bod put his head to one side and stared at her with eyes as gray as thunderclouds. "But you know it, don't you?" Mrs. Owens said, "There's nothing you can do, Bod." "There is. I can learn. I can learn everything I need to know, all I can. I learned about ghoul gates. I learned to dream walk. Miss Lepenskew taught me how to watch the stars. Silas taught me silence. I can haunt. I can fade. I know every inch of this graveyard." Mrs. Owen reached out a hand, touched her son's shoulder. "One day," she said, and then she hesitated. One day she would not be able to touch him. One day he would leave them. One day. And then she said, "Silas told me the man who killed your family was called Jack." Bod said nothing. Then he nodded. "Mother?" "What is it, son?" "When will Silas come back?" The midnight wind was cold, and it came from the north. Mrs. Owens was no longer angry. She feared for her son. She said only, "I wish I knew, my darling boy. I wish I knew." Scarlett Amber Perkins was 15 and at that moment sitting in the upper deck of the elderly bus. She was a mass of angry hate. She hated her parents for splitting up. She hated her mother for moving away from Scotland. Hated her father because he didn't seem to care that she had gone. She hated this town for being so different. Nothing like Glasgow, where she had grown up. And she hated it because every now and again she would turn a corner and see something and the world would all become achingly, horribly familiar. She had lost it with her mother that morning. "At least in Glasgow, I had friends," Scarlett had said, and she wasn't quite shouting, and she wasn't quite sobbing. "I'll never see them again." All her mother had to say in reply was, "At least you're somewhere you've been before. I mean, we lived here when you were little." "I don't remember," said Scarlett, "and it's not like I still know anyone. Do you want me to find my old friends from when I was 5? Is that what you want?" And her mother said, "Well, I'm not stopping you." Scarlett had gone through the whole of the school day angry, and she was angry now. She hated her school, and she hated the world, and right now she particularly hated the town bus service. Every day, when school was over, the 97 bus to the city center would take her from her school gates all the way to the end of the street where her mother had rented a small flat. She had waited at the bus stop on that gusty April day for almost half an hour, and no 97 buses had appeared. So when she saw a 121 bus with City Center as its destination, she climbed aboard. But where her bus always turned right, this one turned left into Old Town, past the municipal gardens in the Old Town Square, past the statue of Josiah Worthington, Bart, and then crept up a winding hill lined with high houses, as Scarlett's heart sank and her anger was replaced with misery. She walked downstairs, edged forward, eyed the sign telling her not to speak to the driver when the vehicle was in motion, and said, "Excuse me, I wanted to go to Acacia, Acacia Avenue. The driver, a large woman, her skin even darker than Scarlett, said, "You should have got the 97 then." But this goes to the city center. Eventually, but even when you get there, you'll still need to get back, the woman sighed. Best thing you can do, get off here, walk back down the hill. There's a bus stop in front of the old town. From there, you can catch the number 4 or the 58. Both of them will get you most of the way to Acacia Avenue. You could get off by the sports center and walk up from there. You got all that? The 4 or the 58. I'll let you off here. It was a request stop on the side of the hill, just past a large pair of open iron gates, and it looked uninviting and dismal. Scarlett stood in the open doorway of the bus until the bus driver said, "Go on, hop it." She stepped down into the pavement and the bus belched black smoke and roared away. The wind rattled the trees on the other side of the wall. Scarlett began to walk back down the hill. This was why she needed a mobile phone, she thought. If she was so much as 5 minutes late, her mother would freak. But she still wouldn't buy Scarlett a phone of her own. Oh well. She would have to endure another shouting match. It wouldn't be the first, and it won't be the last. By now, she was level with the open gates. She glanced inside and, "That's odd," she said aloud. There's an expression, deja vu, that means that you feel like you've been somewhere before, that you've somehow already dreamed it or experienced it in your mind. Scarlett had experienced it, the knowledge that a teacher was just about to tell them that she'd been to Inverness on holiday, or that someone had dropped a spoon in just that way before. This was different. This wasn't a feeling that she had been this wasn't a feeling that she had been here before. This was the real thing. Scarlett walked through the open gates into the graveyard. A magpie flew up as she walked in, a flash of black and white and iridescent green, and settled on the branches of a yew tree, watching her. Around that corner, she thought, is a church with a bench in front of it, and she turned the corner to see a church, much smaller than the one in her head. A sinister, blocky little Gothic building of gray stone with a jutting spire. In front of it was a weathered wooden bench. She walked over, sat down on the bench, and swung her legs as if she was still a little girl. "Hello, hello," said a voice from behind her. Awful cheek of me, I know, but would you help me hold down this, just really need another pair of hands if it's not too much trouble." Scarlett looked around and saw a man in a fawn-colored raincoat squatting in front of a gravestone. He was holding a large sheet of paper, which was blowing about in the wind. She hurried over to him. "You hold on to it here," said the man. "One hand here, one hand there. That's it. Frightful imposition, I know. Ridiculously grateful." He had a biscuit tin next to him, and in front of the tin he pulled what looked like a crayon the size of a small candle. He began rubbing it back and forth across the stone with easy, practiced movements. "There we go," he said cheerfully. "And here she comes. Oops. A wiggly bit down at the bottom there. Here, here. I think it's meant to be ivy. The Victorians love putting ivy on things. Deeply symbolic, you know. And there we are. You can let go now." He stood up, ran one hand through his gray hair. "Oh, needed to stand. Legs got a bit pins and needlesy," he said. "So, what do you reckon to that?" The actual headstone was covered in green and yellow lichen, and so worn and faded as to almost be undecipherable, but the rubbing was clear. Magella Godspeed Spencer of this parish, 1791 to 1871, lost to all but memory, Scarlett read aloud. "And probably now lost even to that," said the man. His hair was thinning. and he smiled hesitantly and blinked at her through small round glasses, which made him look a little like a friendly owl. A large raindrop splashed down on the paper, and the man hurriedly rolled it up and grabbed his tin box of crayons. Another handful of raindrops, and Scarlet picked up the portfolio the man pointed to, propped up beside a nearby gravestone, and followed him into the tidy porch of the church, where the rain could not touch them. "Thank you so much," said the man. "I don't think it's really going to rain much. Weather forecast for this afternoon said mostly sunny." As if in reply, the wind gusted coldly and the rain began to beat down in earnest. "I know what you're thinking," the gravestone rubbing man said to Scarlet. "You do?" she said. She had been thinking, "My mom will kill me." "You're thinking, is this a church or a funeral chapel?" And the answer is, as far as I can ascertain, that on this site there was indeed a small church, and the original graveyard would have been its churchyard. That's as long ago as 8, perhaps 900 AD, rebuilt and extended several times in there. But there is a fire here in the 1820s, and by the time it was already too small for the area. People around here were using St. Dunstan in the village square as their parish church, so when they came to rebuild here, they made it a funeral chapel, keeping many of the original features. The stained glass windows as far in the far wall are said to be original. "Actually," said Scarlet, "I was thinking that my mom is going to kill me. I got the wrong bus and I'm already so late home." "Good Lord, you poor thing," said the man. "Look, I live only just down the road. You wait here." And with that, he thrust his portfolio, his tin crayons, and his rolled up sheet of paper into her hands, and he set off at a trot down the gates, his shoulders hunched against the driving rain. A couple minutes later, Scarlet saw the lights of a car and heard the sound of a horn. Scarlet ran down the gates where she could see the car, an elderly green Mini. The man she had been talking to was sitting in a driver's seat. He wound down his window. "Come on," he said. "Where exactly am I taking you?" Scarlet stood there, the rain running down her cheek. "I don't take rides from strangers," she said. "Quite right, too," said the man. "But one good turn deserves, all that. Here, put the stuff in the back before it gets soaked." He pulled open the passenger door, and Scarlet leaned inside and put his grave rubbing equipment down in the back seat as best she could. "Tell you what," he said. "Why don't you phone your mother? You can use my phone and tell her my car's number plate. You can do it from inside the car. You're getting soaked out here." Scarlet hesitated. Rain was beginning to plaster her hair down. It was cold. The man reached over and handed her his mobile phone. Scarlet looked at it. She realized she was more afraid of calling her mother than she was of getting into the car. Then she said, I could call the police too, couldn't I?" "You certainly can, yes. Or you can walk home. Or you can just call your mother and ask her to come and pick you up." Scarlet got into the passenger seat and closed the door. She kept hold of the man's phone. "Where do you live?" the man asked. "You really don't have to. I mean, you could just take me to the bus stop. I'll take you home. Address?" 102A Acacia Avenue. It's off the main road, a wee bit past the big sports center. "You are out of your way, aren't you?" "Right. Let's get you home." He took off the handbrake, swung the car around, and drove down the hill. "Been living here long?" he said. "Not really. We moved here just after Christmas. We lived here when I was 5, though." "Is that a brogue I detect in your accent?" "We've been living in Scotland for 10 years. There, I sounded like everyone else. And then I came down here, and now I stick out like a sore thumb." She wanted it to sound like a joke, but it was true, and she could hear it as she said it. Not funny, just bitter. The man drove to Acacia Avenue, parked in front of the house, then insisted on coming up to the front door with her. When the door was open, he said, "Frightfully sorry. I took the liberty of bringing your daughter back to you. Obviously, you taught her well. Shouldn't accept rides from strangers. But, well, it was raining. She took the wrong bus, wound up on the other side of town. Bit of a mess all around, really. Say, you can find it in your heart to forgive her and me." Scarlett expected her mother to shout at both of them, and she was surprised and relieved when her mother only said, "Well, you couldn't be too careful these days. And was Mr. a teacher? And would he like a cup of tea?" Mr. said his name was Frost, but she could call him Jay. And Mrs. Perkins, sorry, and Mrs. Perkins smiled and said he could call her Nuna, and she put the kettle on. Over tea, Scarlett told her mother the story of her wrong bus adventure and how she had found herself at the graveyard and how she met Mr. Frost by the little church. Mrs. Perkins dropped her teacup. They were sitting around the table in the kitchen, so the cup didn't fall very far and it didn't break, just spilled tea. Mrs. Perkins apologized awkwardly and went and got a cloth from the sink to mop it up. Then she said, "The graveyard on the hill in the old town, that one?" "I live over that way," said Mr. Frost. "Been doing a lot of grave rubbings. And you know it's technically a nature reserve." Miss Perkins said, "I know," thin lipped. Then she said, "Thank you so much for giving Scarlett a ride home, Mr. Frost." Every word might have been an ice cube. Then, "I think you should leave now." "I say, that's a bit much," said Frost amiably. "Didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Was it something I said?" "The rubbings, they're for a local history project. It's not as if I am, digging up bones or anything." For a heartbeat, Scarlett thought that her mother was going to strike Mr. Frost, who looked worried. But Mrs. Perkins shook her head and said, "Sorry, family history, not your fault." As if she was making a conscious effort, she said brightly, Scarlett actually used to play in that graveyard when she was little. This is, 10 years ago. She had an imaginary friend, too, a little boy called Nobody Owens." A smile twitched in the corner of Mr. Frost's lips. "A ghosty?" "No, I don't think so. He just lived there. She even pointed out the tomb he lived in. So I suppose he was a ghost. Do you remember, love?" Scarlett shook her head. "I must have been a funny kid," said Scarlett. She said, "I'm sure that you are nothing of the, said Mr. Frost. "You are raising a fine girl here, Nuna. Well, lovely cup of tea. Always a joy to make new friends. I'll be toddling off now. Got to make myself a little dinner. Then I've got a meeting at the local history society." "You're making your own dinner," said Mrs. Perkins. "Yes, making it, well, defrosting it really. I'm also a master of the boil in the bag, eating for one, living on my own, bit of a crusty old bachelor. Actually, in the papers, that always means gay, doesn't it? Not gay, just never met the right woman." And for a moment he looked rather sad. Mrs. Perkins, who hated to cook, announced that she always cooked too much food at the weekend, and as she ushered Mr. Frost to the hall, Scarlett heard him agree that he would love to come by. He would love to come around for dinner on Saturday night. When Mrs. Perkins came back into the front hall, all she said to Scarlett was, "I hope you've done your homework." Scarlett was thinking about the afternoon's events as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of the cars grinding their way along the main road. She had been there in that graveyard when she was little. That is why everything had seemed so familiar. In her mind, she imagined and she remembered, and somewhere in there she fell asleep. But in sleep, she still walked the paths of the graveyard. It was night, but she could see everything as clearly as if it were day. She was on the side of the hill, and there was a boy about her age standing with his back to her, looking at the lights of the city. Scarlett said, "Boy, what are you doing?" He looked around, seemed to have trouble focusing. "Who said that?" And then, "Oh, I can see you sort of. Are you dream walking?" "I think I'm dreaming," she agreed. "Not quite what I meant," said the boy. "Hello, I'm Bod." "I'm Scarlett," she said. He looked at her again as if seeing her for the first time. "Of course you are. I knew you looked familiar. You were in the graveyard today with that man, the one with the paper." "Mr. Frost," she said. "He's really nice. He gave me a lift home." Then she said, "Did you see us?" "Yeah, I keep my eye on most things that happen in the graveyard." "What kind of name is Bodge?" she asked. "It's short for nobody." "Of course," said Charlotte. "That's what this dream is about. You're my imaginary friend from when I was little, all grown up." He nodded. He was taller than she was. He wore gray, although she could not have described his clothes. His hair was too long, and she thought it had been some time since he had received a haircut. He said, "You are really brave. We went deep into the hill and we saw the Indigo Man, and you met the Sleer." Something happened then in her head, a rushing and a tumbling, a whirl of darkness and a crash of images. "I remember," said Scarlet, but she said it to the empty darkness of her bedroom and heard nothing in reply but a low tundral of a distant lorry making its way through the night. I think this is a good place to stop. It's got a nice little pause there at the top of page 229. So, what I want you to do is to go ahead and work through your plot diagram. You should be able to fill out, you may not be able to fill out the conflict as yet. I don't think we've really gotten to the conflict, but you can definitely go ahead and get those characters and setting on your plot diagram filled out. Um, yeah, I think that's about where you would stand right now. Go ahead and do that. Make sure you put your name at the top of your paper and specify that this is for chapter 7. Okay? If you have any questions, ask me in class. And otherwise, have a great day. Bye bye.